Hey everybody, welcome back to the Anarchist audio library. Today we are going to be actually continuing on with uploads that I started in 2022. I was recording on my phone and have been re-uploading some of those with some cleaned up audio, and I figured while I'm here I might as well finish the rest of the book. So this is Chapter 2, Part 3 of Anarchism and the Black Revolution, written by Lorenzo Kom'boa Ervin and read by Sen Naomi Kirsch-Schultz. Unemployment and homelessness. In the first 3 months of 1993, the U.S. Labor Department's Bureau of Labor Statistics listed official unemployment rates at about 6 million persons, or just 7 of the labor force. Under capitalism, half that figure is quote-unquote normal, and nonsensically is considered by capitalist economists as, quote, full employment, unquote, even though this is millions of people consigned to economic poverty of the worst sort. But the government figures are intentionally conservative and do not include those who have given up actively searching for jobs, the underemployed who can't make enough to live on, the part-time workers who can't find a full-time or steady job, and the homeless, of which there are now between 3 to 5 million alone. Of the 6 million people that the government does count as jobless now, less than 3 million are given any unemployment compensation or other federal or state aid. The rest are left to starve, steal, or hustle for their survival. A person without a job under the capitalist system is counted as nothing. Every worker has the human right to a job, yet under capitalism, workers are dismissed from employment in times of business crisis, overproduction, depression, or just to save labor costs through less workers and more speed up. And some workers cannot find jobs in the capitalist labor market because of lack of skills or racial or social discrimination. But the government's figures lie. Private researchers state that the total number of people who want full-time jobs and thus cannot find them amounts to nearly 14.3 million persons. Clearly, then, this is a crisis situation of broad proportions. But all the government is doing is juggling and hiding figures. But the figures do show that blacks, Latinos, and women are bearing the brunt of the current depression. The National Urban League, in its, quote, Bidden Unemployment Index, unquote, included as part of its annual State of Black America report, reports levels of 15 to 38% for black adults 25 and older, and incredible levels of 44 to 55% for teens and young adults 17 to 24 years old. In fact, black youth unemployment has not declined at all since the 1974 to 1975 recession. It has stayed at an official level of 35 to 40%, but in the major cities like Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles, the real unemployment rate is more like 70%. For black youth, the unemployment rate is 3 to 5 times higher than that of white youth. Capitalism is making economic exiles of black people as a whole. The fact is that unemployment is concentrated in the black and Hispanic communities, and is greatly responsible for the most destructive tendencies, inhuman relations, and deteriorating neighborhoods. Crime, prostitution, suicide, drug addiction, gang fighting, mental illness, alcoholism, and the breakup of the black family and other social ills all are rooted in the lack of jobs and the denial of essential social services in their communities. It is actually racial genocide in the form of social neglect. Unemployment is profitable for the bosses because it drives down the wages of workers and helps the employers to keep the workforce under control through this, quote, reserve army of labor, unquote, which are allegedly always ready to scab. Because of pervasive discrimination against blacks, Latinos, and other nationally oppressed workers, including higher levels of unemployment, the jobs they do get are generally on the bottom rung. This is also profitable for the boss and divides the working class. Homelessness is just the most intensified form of unemployment, where in addition to loss of job or income, there is loss of housing and lack of access to social services. There are now millions of people homeless since the last 15 years because of the capitalist offensive to destroy the unions, beat back the gains of the civil rights struggle, and do away with the affordable housing sector in favor of yuppie gentrification in the cities. You see them in cities, big and small, and what this reflects is a total breakdown in the capitalist state's social services system, in addition to the heating up of the class war waged by government and the major corporations. It shows more than anything that capitalism worldwide is undergoing an international financial panic and is really in the beginning stages of a world depression. In addition to the 90 million persons who live below the poverty line and 3 to 5 million homeless in the US, there are another 2.7 million homeless in the 12 nations of the European community, and 80 million people are living in poverty there, with millions more in the capitalist countries of Japan, Korea, and other parts of Asia. So although black workers must organize and fight against homelessness and unemployment in the US, clearly there must be an international movement of workers to fight this economic deprivation as part of the overall class struggle. In every city in North America, the black workers' movement should organize unemployment councils to fight for unemployment benefits and jobs for the jobless, the building of decent, affordable low-income housing, and an end to homelessness, as well as against racial discrimination in jobs and housing. Such councils would be democratic organizations organized on a neighborhood basis to ensure that it would be under the control of the people and against infiltration and takeover by liberal or quote-unquote radical political parties, or cooptation by the government, which would be federated into a citywide, regional, and national organization. That organization would be a national black unemployment league to create a mass fight-back movement in this depression. It would be made up of black community unemployed councils from all over the country with delegates elected from all the local groups. Such a national organization could meet to map out a large-scale attack on unemployment, as well as serve as a national clearinghouse on black unemployment conditions. On the local level in the black neighborhoods, it would be the community unemployment councils which would establish food and housing cooperatives, lead rent strikes and squatting, initiate land and building reclamation projects, establish producer and consumer cooperatives, distribute food and clothing, and provide for other services. They would establish neighborhood medical clinics for free treatment of the homeless and unemployed, rodent control programs, etc., and they would deal with community social problems brought on by unemployment and other issues of interest. They would build hunger marches and other demonstrations and carry the people's wrath to various government offices and to the businesses of the rich. Not only would the unemployment councils be a way of fighting for jobs and unemployment benefits, but also the councils would be a way to obtain a great deal of community self-sufficiency and direct democracy instead of totally depending on City Hall, Congress, or the President, and helps lead to the kind of confidence among the masses that a black municipal commune becomes a serious possibility. One of the most important functions of an unemployment movement is to obtain unity between the employed and unemployed or homeless, and workers' solidarity across race lines. The employed and unemployed must work together to struggle against the boss class if they are to obtain any serious gains during this period of economic crisis. Workers who are on strike or protesting against the boss would be supported by the unemployed, who would even man the picket lines with them and refuse to scab. In turn, the workers would form unemployed caucus in their trade unions to allow union representation of these workers and also force such unions to provide food and other necessities, make funds and training available to the unemployed, as well as throw the weight of the unions in the fight for decent jobs and housing for all workers. The capitalist bosses will not be moved otherwise. Make the bosses pay for their economic crisis. Here is what a united movement of workers and homeless must demand. First, full employment, zero unemployment for all workers at union wage. Second, establishment of a shorter work week so that workers would be paid at the rate for 40 hours of work for 20 to 30 hours a week on the job. Third, end homelessness, build and make available decent, affordable housing for all. Repeal all loitering, anti-panhandling, and other laws against the homeless. Fourth, end the war budget and use those funds for decent, low-income housing, better schools, hospitals and clinics, libraries, parks, and public transportation. Fifth, end racism and sexism in job opportunities and relief benefits. Sixth, jobs or a guaranteed income for all. Seventh, full federal and state benefits for unemployed workers and their families, including corporate and government funds to pay the bills, rents, and debts for any laid-off worker, and unemployment compensation at 100% of regular wage, lasting the full length of a worker's period of unemployment. Eighth, national minimum wage set at prevailing union entry wage. Ninth, government and corporate funds to establish a public works program to provide jobs with full union rights and wage scale to rebuild the inner cities and provide needed social services. The program and its funds should be under the control of committees democratically elected from poor and black neighborhoods, so as to avoid, quote, poverty pimps, unquote, and rip off job agencies or government bureaucrats. 10th, free all persons in prison for crimes of economic survival. These, and the demands previously mentioned, are merely a survival program and agenda for unemployed workers. The real answer is social revolution, the elimination of capitalism, and workers' self-management of the economy and society. This is a vital first step, however. There would be no unemployment or social need for wage labor in an anarchist communist society. Crimes against the people. It is the rich who decide what is or is not a crime. It is not a neutral designation. The laws are written to protect the rich and those who act as agents of the state. But most personal crimes are not committed against the rich. They are usually inaccessible. It is poor and working-class black people who are the major victims of violent crime. The black female is the primary victim of rape and abuse by the black male in this country. The black male himself is the leading homicide victim in the U.S., by another black man like himself, and sadly our children are among the leading victims of child abuse, many times by his or her own parents. We do not like to think of these things in the black community, but we are battering and killing ourselves at an alarming rate. This is not to deny that the capitalist social system has created frustrating, degrading conditions of life that contribute to this brutality and fratricide, but we would be lax in our humane and revolutionary duty if we did not try to correct this problem on the short term and also make black people assume responsibility for our actions. I'm not talking some black conservative or, quote, law and order, unquote, garbage here, but rather recognition of fact that we have a problem. We have an external and an internal crisis situation facing us in our community. The external crisis is racism and colonialism, which works to systematically oppress us and is responsible for whatever internal crisis there is. The internal crisis is the result of an environment where drugs and violence, both social and physical, are rampant, and life is sometimes considered cheap. Black-on-black crimes and internal violence are destroying our community. It is undoubtedly self-hatred and the desperate economic and social conditions we live under which makes us prey on each other. Drugs, frustrated rage, prostitution, and other vices are symptoms of oppression. We kill, beat, rape, and brutalize each other because we are in pain ourselves. Thus, we are acting out antisocial roles defined for us by someone else, not ourselves. In our pain and confusion, we strike out at convenient and familiar victims, those like ourselves. They are ordinary black people who steal and rob just to survive under this system because of that unequal distribution of wealth. Further, for some of us, in our desire to quote-unquote make it in capitalist society, we will stop at nothing, including murder. And finally, there are those who do whatever they do because of drug addiction or mental sickness. Whatever the reasons, we have a serious problem that we must remedy because it is tearing away at the moral and social fabric of our community. It will be impossible to unite black people if they are in fear and hatred of one another. It is also obvious that the police and government do not rectify this problem and that only the black community can do so. The courts and prison prevent the situation from recurring. Therefore, what can we do? It is the community, through its own organizations of concern, which will have to deal with this problem. Community self-managed programs to work with black youth gang members, a source of much violence in the community, rather than the military approach of calling in the cops, empower the community rather than the racist prison bureaucracy and the cops. Also, the community-run drug rehabilitation groups, therapy and counseling groups, and other neighborhood organizing help us to effectively deal with the problem of internal violence and hopefully diffuse it. Most importantly, it involves the community in the effort. But we cannot totally depend upon counseling or rehabilitation techniques, especially where there is an immediate threat of violence or where it has occurred. So, to ensure peace and public security, a black community guard service would be organized for this purpose, as well as to protect against the white power structure. This security force would be elected by local residents and would work with the help of people in neighborhoods. This is the only way it would work. It would not be an auxiliary of the current colonial occupation army in our community and would not threaten or intimidate the community with violence against our youth. Nor would such a community guard protect vice and organized crime. This community guard would only represent the community that elected it instead of City Hall. Similar such units would be organized all over the city on a block-by-block basis. Yet the anarchists go further and say that after a municipal commune is set up, the existing courts must be replaced by voluntary community tribunals of arbitration, and in cases of grave crimes connected with murder or offenses against liberty and equality, a special communal court of a non-permanent nature would be set up. Anarchists believe that antisocial crime, meaning anything that oppresses, robs, or does violence to the working class, must be vigorously opposed. We cannot wait until after the revolution to oppose such dangerous enemies of the people. But since such antisocial crimes are a direct expression of capitalism, there would need to be a real attempt to socialize, politically educate, and rehabilitate offenders, not by throwing them into the white capitalist prisons to suffer like animals, and where, because of their torture and humiliation, they will declare war on all society, but by involving them in the life of the community and giving them social and vocational training. Since all the, quote, criminology experts, unquote, agree that crime is a social problem, and since we know that 88% of all crimes are against property, and are committed in order to survive in an economically unjust society, we must recognize that only full employment, equal economic opportunity, decent housing, and other aspects of social justice will ensure an end to crime. In short, we must have radical social change to eradicate the social conditions that cause crime. An unequal, unfair society like capitalism creates its own criminal class. The real thieves and murderers, businessmen and politicians are protected under today's legal system, while the poor are punished. That is class justice, and that is what social revolution would abolish. But understandably, many persons want to end the rape, murder, and violence in our communities today, and wind up strengthening the hands of the state and its police agents. They will not get rid of crime, but the cops will militarily patrol our communities and further turn us against one another. We must stay away from that trap. Frustrated and confused, black people may attack one another, but instead of condemning them to a slow death in prison or shooting them down in the streets for revenge, we must deal with the underlying social causes behind the act. Anarchists should begin to have community forums on the cause and manifestations of crime in the black community. We have to seriously examine the social institutions, family, schools, prisons, jobs, etc. that cause us to fuss, fight, rob, and kill each other, rather than the enemy who is causing all our misery. While we should mobilize to restrain offenders, we must begin to realize that only the community will effectively deal with the matter. Not the racist capitalist system with its repressive police, courts, and prisons. Only we have psychology and understanding to deal with it. Now, we must develop the will. No one else cares. Instead, for eye punishment, there should be restitution to the victims, their families, or society. No revenge, such as the death penalty, will bring a murder victim back, nor will long-term imprisonment serve either justice or the protection of society. After all, prisons are only human trash cans for those that society has discarded as worthless. No sane and just society would adopt such a course. Society makes criminals and must be responsible for their treatment. White capitalist society is itself a crime and is the greatest teacher of corruption and violence. In an anarchist society, prisons would be done away with along with courts and police, except for the exceptions I've alluded to, and be replaced with community-run programs and centers interested solely with human regeneration and social training, rather than custodial supervision in an inhuman lockup. The fact is that if a person is so violent or dangerous, he is probably mentally warped or has some physical defect anyway, which causes him to commit violent acts after social justice has been won. If such people are mentally defective, then they should be placed in a mental health facility, rather than a prison. Human rights should never be stripped, and he should not be punished. Schools, hospitals, doctors, and above all, social equality, public welfare, and liberty might prove the safest means to get rid of crimes and criminals altogether. If a special category such as quote-unquote criminal or quote-unquote enemy is created, then these persons may forever feel an outcast and never change. Even if he or she is a class enemy, they should retain all civil and human rights in society, even though they, of course, would be restrained if they led a counter-revolution. The difference is we want to defeat them ideologically, not militarily or by consigning them to a so-called re-education camp or to be shot, like the Bolsheviks did when assuming power in Russia in 1917. There are two major reasons why activists in the black community, as we move to change society, its values, its conditions, must immediately take a serious look and act to change the political debate around crime, prisons, and the so-called criminal justice system. Those two reasons hit right home. One is because during any given year, 1 out of 4 black men in this country is in prison, in jail on parole, on probation, compared to just 1 of every 15 white men. In fact, blacks make up 50 to 85% of most prison populations around the U.S., making a truism of the radical phraseology that, quote, prisons are concentration camps for the black and poor, unquote. It may be your brother, sister, husband, wife, daughter, or son in prison, but I guarantee you we all know someone in prison at this very minute. The other primary reason blacks have a vested interest in crime and penal institutions is because, by far, most blacks and other non-whites are in prison for committing offenses against their own community. Prisons are compact duplicates of the black community, in that many of the same negative and destructive elements that are allowed to exist in our community and cause crime, especially drugs, are in poison, in a more blatant and concentrated form. To call such places, quote, correctional, unquote, or, quote, rehabilitative, unquote, institutions is a gross misnomer. Death camps are more like it. These prisons do not exist to punish everyone equally, but to protect the existing capitalist system from you and I, the poor and working class. The high rate of recidivism proves, and the so-called authorities all agree, that the prison system is a total failure. About 70% of those entering prison are repeat offenders who commit increasingly serious crimes. The brutality or prison experience and the, quote, ex-con, unquote, stigma when they are finally released make them worse. Basic to solving these crucial problems is organization. The black community and the black liberation movement must support the prisoners in their fight for prisoners' human rights. They should fight for the release of political prisoners and victims of racial injustice. They should also form coalitions of groups in the black community to fight against the racist penal and judicial system, and especially the unequal application of the death penalty, which is just another form of genocide against the black race. And finally, and maybe most importantly, local community groups must begin programs of re-education with brothers and sisters in prison, because only through planned, regular, and constant contact can we begin to resolve this problem that so directly touches our lives. Abolish prisons. The drug epidemic, a new form of black genocide? One of the worst forms of criminality is drug dealing, and it deserves some separate comments all its own. There is a negative drug subculture in the black community that glorifies, or at least makes acceptable, drug use, even though it is killing us and destroying our community. In fact, every day we read of some junkie in our communities dying over an overdose of drugs, or of some street corner drug dealer dying from a shootout over a dispute or tip-off during a drug deal, quote, gone sour, unquote. The tragedy of the latter is that, these days, innocent victims, children or elderly people, have also been gunned down in the crossfire. The drug addict, the new term seems to be, quote, crackhead, unquote, is another tragic figure. He was a human being just like anyone else, but because of his oppressed social environment, sought drugs to ease the pain or to escape temporarily from the, quote, concrete jungles, unquote, we are forced to live in the urban ghettos of America. With the introduction of crack, a more powerful derivative of cocaine which made its appearance in the 1980s, even more problems and tragedies of this sort had developed, more addicts, more street gang killings, and more deterioration of our community. In the major urban areas, there have almost always been drug uses. What is new is the depth of geographical penetration of crack to black communities in all areas of the country. But the spread of crack is just a follow-up to massive government drug peddling that began at the end of the decade of the 1960s. The White House is the, quote, rock house, unquote, meaning the U.S. political administration is behind the whole drug trade. The U.S. government has actually been smuggling drugs into this country for many years aboard CIA and military planes to use as a chemical warfare weapon against black America. These drugs were mostly heroin imported from the so-called, quote, Golden Triangle, unquote, of Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. But with the introduction of crack cocaine, there was no need to import drugs into the country at the same extent as before, because it could be chemically prepared in a mainland lab and then distributed immediately. Crack created a whole new generation of drug clients and customers for the drug dealers. It was cheap and highly addictive. Crack and other drugs are a huge source of profits for the government, and it keeps the black community passive and politically indifferent. That is the main reason why we cannot depend upon the police force and or the government to stop the drug traffic or to help the victims hooked on drugs. They are pushing the drugs to beat us down on the one hand, but the state is also made more powerful because of the phony, quote, war on drugs, unquote, which allows police-state measures in black and oppressed communities, and because of millions of dollars in government monetary appropriations made of, quote, law enforcement, unquote, agencies, who supposedly are putting down the traffic in drugs, but they never go after the bankers or the big business pharmaceutical companies who fund the drug trade, just the street-level dealers, who are usually poor blacks. Unemployment is another reason that drug trafficking is so prevalent in our communities. Poor people will desperately look for anything to make money with, even the very drugs that are destroying our communities. But if people have no jobs or income, drugs look very lucrative and the best way out of the situation. In fact, the drug economy has become the only income in many poor black communities, and the only thing that some people perceive will lift them out of lives of desperate poverty. Clearly, decent jobs at a union wage are part of the answer to ending drug trafficking in our community, rather than a dependence on police, courts, and the state. The cops are not our friends or ally and must be exposed for their part in protecting the trade, rather than suppressing it. Only the community can stop drug trafficking, and it is our responsibility, however you look at it. After all, those junkies are our brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, neighbors and friends. They are no strangers. We must organize to save their lives and the life of our community. We must establish anti-dope programs in black communities all over the country. We must expose and counter the government's role as pusher of dope, along with that of the police as protector of the drug trade. But also we must be prepared to help the drug victims with street counseling, street clinics where they can clean up and learn a trade and the socio-political reasons for drug use. Propaganda against drug use and other activities. Junkies are the victims of the drug society which thinks it's cool to use drugs. Children are some of the biggest victims of drug dealing when they are tricked or forced by economic necessity into using or selling it. The users and dealers both are victims, but the dealers are something else than entirely innocent. Even though that black on the corner selling dope bags is a victim himself of the economic and political system which makes him do it, dope dealers are a corrupt, dangerous breed who must be stopped. Many people have been killed or seriously injured for naively trying to oppose dope dealers and make them leave their neighborhoods. Therefore, whereas the policy with junkies would be more benevolent and understanding, with dope dealers we must be cautious and even ruthless when it is called for. We need to try to win them over first with an economic and political program to draw them away from the drug trade. But many of the dealers are so violence-prone, especially the quote-unquote big shots, who are also protected by the cops. They must be opposed by both military and political means. We are not advocating the summary murder of people, but we are saying if it takes death to bring about a change in the community, so be it. The issue of death is essentially an issue of who is doing the dying. It can be direct and exercised against the death merchant, or it can be indirect and exercised against our youth, if we let it. To be aware of a dangerous situation and not move to change it is to be as responsible for that dangerous situation as those who created it in the first place. Listen, I don't want to simplify this problem by saying that just kill a few street-level dealers and that will end it. No, it won't, and we don't want to do that anyway. They are just poor people trying to survive this system, just pawns in the drug game whose lives don't matter to the big capitalists or government. When they say so, these street-level dealers will be killed or imprisoned, but the drug peddling system will go on. This is a socio-political problem which can best be addressed by grassroots organizations. But it's the corporate and industrial backers of the drug trade, not just the corner dealer, that must not only be exposed, but must be moved on. In addition to educational agitation and other action, there must be military action by revolutionary cells. The underground actions which we are asking people to move can be carried out by a relatively small group of dedicated people, a revolutionary cell of armed fighters who have been trained in guerrilla tactics. But even these small groups of people must have the support of the neighborhoods in order to function. Otherwise, people will not know it from another violent gang. Once this social cohesiveness exists among the community, then we can begin to put this proposal into action against the most violent, high-level drug dealers. We are addressing ourselves to what can be considered to be guidelines for dealing with the problem on a neighborhood or community-wide level than at a national level. First, set up drug education classes in the community for the youth, especially to expose the nature of the drug trade, who it hurts, and how the government, banks, and pharmaceutical companies are behind it all. Second, exposure of the death merchants and their police protectors. Photos, posters, flyers, newsletters, etc. Third, harassment of the dealers, i.e. threatening phone calls, knocking the drug, quote, product, unquote, have citizens marching inside their, quote, place of business, unquote, and other tactics. Fourth, set up drug rehabilitation clinics so that junkies can be treated, can study the nature of their oppression, and can be won over to revolutionary politics. We must win people away from drug use and to the revolution. Fifth, physical elimination of the dealer, intimidation driving him out of a neighborhood or out of town, beatings, and assassination where necessary. Dope is death. You must fight dope addiction by any means necessary. Do all you can to help your people in the anti-dope war. Alright, I think I'll call it here. There seems to be enough of a section to do one more piece of it. We just wrapped up Anarchism and the Black Revolution, Chapter 2, Part 3. Thanks for reading along with me. Stay tuned for the last piece of Chapter 2.